So thanks for everyone for joining us this morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll run through two key topics this morning. Firstly, I'd like to cover off on and give you a bit of an update on some of the supply conditions in Australia at the moment, and also provide a bit of a forecast for future growth over the next few years. Secondly, I'll touch base on some of the global demand side factors we're seeing at the moment. There's been some fairly sizable influences on global markets, such as African swine fever and obviously the likes of COVID-19. And then I'll hand over back to Nick to finish off and put some of these trends into a Middle East and North Africa context with some more local and regional trade flow trends. So in terms of supply conditions in Australia at the moment, we've basically seen it all over the last 2 years. If you've tuned into news that's covered Australian weather, you would have seen everything from fire to floods. If you rewind the clock back to the start of 2019, you'll remember that we had fairly severe flooding across northern Queensland, which impacted some cattle producing regions. 2019 then continued into the continuation of fairly severe drought conditions across key cattle and sheep producing regions. And then we also saw fairly severe bushfires at the start of this year as well. Fortunately for a lot of livestock producing regions, 2020 has been a vast improvement on the last couple of years, with a lot of regions having fairly substantial rainfall and emerging from those drought conditions. So while all these factors you may have seen in the headlines, it's really the drought and now the recovery from drought that's driving production trends in Australia at the moment. While fire and floods have been very impactful on certain producing regions and certain producers at a national level, impacting supply and price, it's really that drought and now the emergence from drought that we're seeing impacting some of the supply and export trends that we've seen so far this year. So looking at how those the drought and the recovery from drought has impacted supply, we can look at the Australian national herd and sheep flock. So on the left-hand side, you can see the national herd, and it's typically hovered between 26 and 29 million head over the last decade or two. But you can see more recently that over those drought years, we have seen a fairly substantial decline as producers have to offload surplus stock because there simply isn't pasture availability. You can see a similar trend in the sheep flock over the last couple of years, with the drought impacting overall numbers there as well. Fortunately, however, this year has marked a turnaround with those improving seasonal conditions, giving producers the ability to rebuild some of those herd numbers and flock numbers. So in the short term, this does put a bit of pressure on supply, as we've seen so far at periods this year. But in the medium to long term, this will mean that there's more livestock to turn off and drive that future production. As well as those drought and the recovery from drought conditions that we've seen, we have also seen some influence or more disruption from COVID-19. So we've seen this come through in a few different areas. Firstly, we've seen the disruption to reefer container flows and availability. This was most noticeable when China went to lockdown earlier this year, but changing shipping schedules, blank sailings have also caused disruption to container flows. And we've also seen some industrial action at ports in Australia, which has also compounded some of those shortages. Most importantly, for the Middle East, we have seen some impact on air freight and air freight cargo capacity, which has really squeezed our ability in some instances to supply some markets and also increase the cost of servicing some markets as well. And then thirdly, particularly in Victoria over the winter months this year, we did see some capacity changes as COVID-19 was rising in the community. Some abattoirs had to slow capacity or reduce chain speeds to accommodate some of those risk mitigation measures. But fortunately, those have now been wound back as COVID-19 cases in Victoria have steadily declined and are now at about zero. So COVID-19 has created some challenges for the industry, but overall, trade has continued to flow. And really, it's those drought and the recovery from drought conditions that we've seen that have really been the primary drivers of supply and exports in 2020. So looking at some of those national trends, we've seen a fairly substantial reduction in beef production this year, and we're expecting national beef production to decline about 15% in 2020. We are forecasting, however, a bit of a modest recovery next year, up about 1%, and then future growth in the coming years as that herd rebuild starts to flow through to increase production. Translating that into exports, given that we export about 70% of our beef production, it's a fairly similar trend. Exports are back about 17% this year, but they still are above that 1 million tonne mark, which prior to 2013 hadn't actually been reached before. So while they're back compared to the last couple of years, they're still historically high when looking over a longer period. Looking ahead, we are expecting a bit of a recovery next year and more of that to come through in the next couple of years. What's supporting some of the tight supply shortages of surplus cattle at the moment has been increased weights. So on the right-hand side, we've got the average male and female carcass weight out of Australia. And over the long term, these have generally been increasing, partly due to genetics, but also due to the increased use of grain finishing cattle in Australia, which has really taken out some of the volatility of supply. Looking at the three main channels for Australian cattle, be it live export or grass-fed or grain-fed slaughter, grain-fed has been increasing as a contributor to that turn-off channel. And that's really supported carcass weights in the last couple of years as we've gone through drought conditions. Turning to sheep meat production and exports now. Here we have Australian lamb production at a national level, and you can see the dip in 2020 that we're forecasting. However, most of that dip has already passed us with the major shortages coming earlier this year. And so far through the spring flush in southeastern Australia, we're seeing fairly typical or normal supplies of lambs coming through onto the market. Looking forward, we are then expecting future growth in lamb production in line with that longer term steady growth that we've seen over the last couple of decades. However, where we are seeing some supply shortages is really in mutton production. And mutton production is far more sensitive to that flock rebuild than the likes of lamb production. And so you can see this year there's a fairly sharp decline in those orange bars in total national lamb production, total national mutton production. And they're probably going to remain fairly tight over the next couple of years as we continue to rebuild that flock and producers hold back adult sheep, retain on farm. Looking at how that impacts sheep meat exports, it's a similar story for beef production. We export the vast majority of our sheep meat, but you can also see that growth in exports, particularly on lamb, has been increasing over time. So exports are an increasingly important avenue for our lamb production. So you can see there in 2020, we're expecting lamb exports to decline, but to snap back again to record levels in 2021 and the following years. What will remain or what will keep pressure on supply and overflow into lamb pricing, however, will be the fairly tight mutton supply, which will keep pressure on overall supply of sheep meat. So similar to cattle, what's supporting some of the shortfalls that we've seen this year and will bolster growth in coming years has been that increasing lamb carcass weight, which you can see over the last couple of decades in the chart on the right, has been steadily growing, and we are expecting it to continue to grow. While this has supported overall production, and it means that we can produce more lamb meat from fewer lambs, it does cause a challenge for markets like the Middle East, which prefers a lighter carcass. As these average weights increase, it does mean that there's fewer and fewer of those lighter lambs coming through the system. So there's some of the major supply side conditions and forecasts for the next few years. I think particularly with beef and mutton, supplies have been tighter, but next year they should record a bit of a modest recovery and increase further thereafter. While lamb supplies will likely snap back a bit quicker, given the supply conditions in Australia at the moment, there's plenty of feed available to finish that spring lamb crop that's coming through the system at the moment. So now I'll take a bit of a shift and talk about global demand and Australian exports and some of the main drivers that we've seen so far in 2020. So firstly, here is monthly Australian beef exports so far this year. The first thing to note in the chart on the left-hand side, you can see that pretty much for the first 6 months of the year, exports were fairly stable. There wasn't much sign of any impact from COVID-19. Exports were tracking fairly normally. But really from July onwards, we have seen some of those supply side pressures reduce the availability of product that we can put onto ships. And particularly you can see on the right-hand side there, the year-on-year change in monthly exports. Those declines were particularly sharp from July and peaked in about September. October picked up a little bit, but we're still a fair way below where we were last year. Lamb exports have tracked fairly normally, bar a couple of months earlier this year. There were some shortages through April and May, but otherwise have since bounced back and returned to a fairly normal seasonal trend, which we're expecting to continue over the coming months. Mutton's quite a different story at the moment, and you can see throughout 2020, we've been tracking below year-ago levels, particularly since February this year. Given the recovery in the flock, and that will take a number of years, we are expecting these monthly volumes of mutton available for export to remain fairly tight before kicking back up in 2022 and beyond. So that's some of the short-term export trends. I thought I'd just take a step back now and look at some of the longer-term shifts that we've seen in Australian red meat exports. So firstly here we've got the export split or the split of Australian beef exports across our major markets over the last couple of decades. And there's really two key events or trends that are of note in this chart. Firstly, in the mid to early 2000s, we saw the impact of BSE and the growth in markets such as Japan and Korea. And more recently, you can see there in the dark green, over the last decade, that huge growth in exports going into China, firstly driven by that affluent emerging consumer class, but also more recently, that huge meat shortfall due to African swine fever. So over this period, we have seen some growth in exports to the likes of the Middle East, and it's remained fairly stable over the last 5 or so years on a share basis. Likewise, we can also look at that export split for sheep meat exports. Here you can see similarly that huge growth in the likes of China, but our two other major markets, the US and the Middle East, have remained fairly stable over this period, with most of that growth in China being pulled from other secondary markets, such as the likes of Papua New Guinea or Sub-Saharan Africa, and a bit from Europe. Product to the Middle East has remained fairly stable despite that huge growth coming out of China. So I suppose just looking at those similar trends from a bit of a different angle, I think this is an interesting chart for a number of reasons. This looks at the global trade in meat from all the major meat producers and exporters around the world. And it's on a fiscal year basis, so it's up to June this year. But these trends have continued in more recent months as well. So firstly, I think the most interesting trend here is the fact that looking at all meat being exported from all exporters, we've seen fairly strong growth in 2020. There was talk at the start of this year about supply chains breaking, about trade being disrupted from COVID-19. But in actual fact, we've had the biggest year on record when it comes to meat being moved around the world. And it's fairly consistent across most of the major meat proteins. You can see there in the year to June this year, total meat traded grew by about 5.3%, which is pretty strong compared to that 5-year average prior. But the other really interesting trend here, I think, is just how much China is reflected in these figures, or how much of it is accounted to China. So the chart on the right-hand side looks at exact same data, but just strips out the sales that have been going into China, which is that grey bar at the top. So you can see there, if we ignore China, we get a bit more of a accurate picture of where the other markets are at and some of the disruption that we have seen to demand in 2020. And it also reflects that really strong buying power from China compared to other markets. This has been quite strong in 2020, but this rise of China has also really been a trend more or less over the last decade, as that grey wedge of trade has continually shifted to China. So longer term, that growth in trade with China is being driven by that affluent emerging consumer class. But in the last couple of years, it's really been fast-tracked by African swine fever. Of note at the moment, however, there are signs that China's pork production may have bottomed out and could very well be in recovery phase. The chart on the left-hand side is a forecast by the USDA, which is pegging production to increase this year. But critical, I think, for anyone trading product and watching global markets is really keeping abreast of how quickly this pork recovery is taking place and how much of that lost production can be recovered. If we look at the chart on the right-hand side, this is all meat being exported into the China market on a monthly basis, and this year they've been consuming about 800,000 to 1 million tonnes of product every month. So if that ASF trend can pick up more, there is a lot of meat at the moment flowing into China that may need to find alternative markets. Another major driver of global demand this year has really been COVID-19, which is no surprise. There is fortunately some signs of 2 viable vaccines on the market or coming to the market shortly, which does provide a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. But the economic impact has still been fairly severe this year. On the left-hand side here, we've got the IMF GDP growth forecast for this year and next across major regions, and it's no surprise, everyone knows that basically everywhere has recorded a contraction, probably except China. Unfortunately, we are, or the major economic forecasters are expecting a recovery next year, but between 2019 and where we finish next year, most countries will likely remain poorer from where they started the pandemic. And the ability for countries to bounce back is going to be really critical for meat demand going forward. And it's highly likely that that recovery won't be uniform. Some countries are going to be far more able to bounce back than others, and some will display potential long-term scarring from these events. The other driver, particularly for the meat trade, is really the food service channel, which has been heavily impacted by COVID-19 this year. So this chart on the right-hand side just looks at a few select markets where data is available and food service traffic through restaurants. And you can see there in March and April, food service traffic basically collapsed in most markets. And we have seen a bit of a recovery over the Northern Hemisphere summer, which has been great for food service. But now we're at a point where some markets are going back into contraction phase as lockdowns come back on, while other markets, such as Australia or Singapore, where I am, food service traffic is going fairly strongly. So Australia or Australian red meat, which we estimate food service, we estimate accounts for about 2/3 of Australian red meat sales globally. This channel for us is very important and has been quite disrupting so far this year. And how it plays out going forward could be further disruptive. So I think in light of this, we've got potential disruption coming from the timing of any ASF recovery in the likes of China. And we've also got this uncertain climate created by COVID-19. And it's very difficult to know how quickly economies can recover and consumers and marketing channels can return to normal. Through all this uncertainty, I think it's really important that we're able to respond to opportunities when they arise. So for us, having stable market access is really important for this. Fortunately, Australia's got pretty good favourable market access thanks to a range of free trade deals, particularly in our key markets of the Middle East, Asia, and North America. So this is going to be key in responding to those opportunities as they do arise over coming months and years. That said, though, tariffs aren't everything. There is still a range of non-tariff barriers that we need to be mindful of in this space that we need to navigate as we respond to these demand opportunities. And Nick will touch on those in his presentation as well. So that's all from me. Nick will now discuss in more detail some of those more regional trends in the Middle East and North Africa. I think from a supply side summary, conditions have been tighter due to that herd rebuild that we're seeing. However, they should start to recover from next year and furthermore in the coming years. On a global demand summary, I think we have seen a lot of disruption this year, and the timing of that disruption and when it comes back online will be critical for demand in certain markets.